Hello, Laurie here again with a word of encouragement for you today. Please excuse the way I look because later today I'm going to be painting. I've painted the kitchen, I've painted the bedroom, and now we're reduced to painting the sidewalks, and I'm not kidding. I've been doing things outside to keep myself busy, and another thing that I've been doing that everybody's laughing about is there is, at the back of our house, there is this, we're obviously on a level on the side of a hill, so we have some landscape levels, and there's these big pits of sand because we're out here in the desert, on the high desert in Albuquerque, and there's these pits of sand, and I discovered beneath about 2 feet of sand, bored digging around in the sand, I discovered river rock. I guess over the years that had just sunk. So I also spend a couple of hours a day digging up river rock. So with all that, to say that if you're just extremely bored, go to your backyard. You never know what kind of little treasures you might dig up. In the meantime, I'm here with my vitamin C and my vitamin D3 because my good friend Rebecca says I need to build my immune system. So I encourage everybody to be doing that. And no, we're really doing good. We're trusting in the Lord. Daughter is visiting, and we're all staying our 6 feet or more away and doing everything that we should and doing our part to be responsible. So today, before I got to painting, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about two women who encouraged me greatly. They're two of my top #1 heroes, and they're both from the Old Testament, and that is Ruth and Esther. And both of these women have books of the Bible in the Old Testament named for them, and both of them don't do any teaching per se, like the dog is in my vitamins, any teachings per se, but they are stories. Their stories, their lives teach us a lot about the Lord and his sovereignty. But they're women from two completely different circumstances. But I wrote some notes about them and what their similarities are. And one of the similarities, of course, is that they both have their names are books of the Bible. Both are in the Old Testament. Both end up connected to royalty, even though they both start out in completely different situations. Esther starts out as an orphan in her story, and Ruth is a Moabite who is married to a Jew and who has converted to Judaism. A little bit about Esther. And you know the story, but just to hit a few high points, she is a descendant of exiles who've been exiled to Babylon from Israel. And she is actually, her parents have died, and she's living with an older cousin. And she becomes, through some crazy circumstances, she actually becomes queen of Persia. She marries the king. So you have the story of a Jew moving from a very impoverished situation up into a palace and being in a seat of influence. Ruth her story takes a really tragic turn. Her husband's family had moved to her area and taken, her husband and his brother took on Moabite wives, and her father-in-law died, and then her husband died, her husband's brother died, and she is left with her mother-in-law as her family, and her mother-in-law is just in great grief. She's lost every man in her family, and back in those days, men were the providers of everything, and they are the ones that carried out a family name. And so Ruth, in her sorrows, decides to return to Israel, and Naomi returns to Israel, and Ruth says, I'm going to go with you. And Naomi even tells Ruth, stay here. I've got no family kinsman that can render you a child and carry on our family name. You just need to go marry one of your own people. And Ruth refuses and follows Naomi back to the Jews and begins to live as one, but they're very poor because they're two women without income. And so Ruth is gleaning harvest in the fields behind the harvesters, as was a common practice that they would drop bits of grain so that the poor, through dignity, could work and pick up this grain. So it wasn't like giving free handouts, it was providing work in your fields. Everyone that owned a field was had to do that. It was a legal act. And so Ruth is gleaning with the poor people, gets noticed by the field owner, who turns out to be a distant relative, who her mother-in-law knows, Naomi. He's a noble man. He is the descendant of one of the judges of Israel. And she, Ruth, ends up marrying the owner of that field. He becomes the kinsman redeemer. The family line is carried out, and actually Ruth has a child with this man. His name is Boaz, and this child is Obed, who is King David's grandfather. So Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. So both these women get connected to royalty. But here, those are such quick synopses of the stories. I encourage you to go read them. Ruth is first and Esther is later in the Old Testament. No doubt Esther had heard at this point Ruth's story and seen some similarities. But both women take these heroic acts to get help. Esther puts her life in jeopardy by going to a king, and I talked about this before and I've blogged about it. You can go to my blog at my website, lauriegreenwestlake.com, and read about Esther's story a little more in depth, or just read it. It's an amazing read this afternoon. But Esther goes before the king at a time when that was illegal, at a moment, I should say, when you couldn't go before the king unless you were invited. And she put her life on the line to go and invite him to a banquet, to ask him to intercede on behalf of her people, because an evil man had plotted, with the king's consent, to wipe out the entire Jewish race there. Ruth, on the other hand, does a heroic action to save Naomi's family line, and that is she presents herself to the owner of this field, Boaz. She presents herself to him, and in an action that she does that involves a threshing floor at midnight, she pretty much asks him to cover her in marriage so that this bloodline can continue. So she put her own life, her own needs, her own desires as a young woman. She was probably 40 years younger than Boaz. She puts her own agenda aside for the sake of Naomi's family line. And you should read that too, because I realize even as I'm giving you this really quick synopsis, it raises more questions than answers. But both women are seen in God's eyes, and that's the point of this, as heroes. And in both of these stories, what we see is God's sovereignty being played through their situations, but it's more than that. God's sovereignty is being played through their situations and because of their situations. These stories are perfect examples how God will take whatever your current conditions are, whether you're poor, whether you're rich, you're in a palace, or you're gleaning on a field, whether you're grieving the death of family members, or you're sitting in a palace with handmaidens. God is working through your personal and individual circumstances, not in spite of them, but because of them, because He put you there. And He has you shut up in your house or on quarantine right now because He is working not only through you, but through these circumstances and using you. And so when I get down at the end of the day, or when I wake up in the morning and go, oh no, I can't leave the house again, or, you know, I am doing some work from home, but I really thrive on being in the office with my team. I get to oversee a marketing team at Faith Comes by Hearing, and it's a high energy young people, and we get to have creative ideas and spend our days doing fabulous things, and it's different being home. And yeah, I can see myself getting in a rut, sleeping later than I normally do. I got dressed later than I normally do. But I just keep reminding myself that God is working through my circumstances. He's working through all these circumstances. And we just have to watch for the miracle, because the miracle is coming. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Be blessed. I'm going to go paint. I might even show you next week my new river rock garden that I've dug up. Okay, be blessed.